Dear Biker, my mother is Navajo, and Navajos who grew up on the reservation often hear stories about skinwalkers, known as yeenaadlooshiis. Because of this, nearly everyone is cautious about whom they trust and who they talk about. These creatures are believed to be dangerous individuals who possess the abilities of animals while retaining the cunning intellect of a human. My mother grew up hearing many stories about them, and she passed them down to us to make sure that we understood the dangers in the world and to remind us that God watches over everyone, including little Navajo children. One true story that she shared took place in the 1960s. She and her 4 sisters had spent the day doing chores. Well, that night, my mom and one of her sisters needed to use the bathroom. The outhouse was far from their traditional hogan, and neither of them wanted to walk out there alone in the dark, so they went together. It was late, and the only light came from the moon. As they approached the outhouse, they heard faint sounds, something like a bird whistle. It seemed to be circling around them, following them through the darkness. Clinging to one another, they just kept going. To their surprise, the outhouse door was standing wide open. Normally, it would be latched or wired shut. As they got closer, they saw a large black figure sitting inside the outhouse. They couldn't make out any features, but it was human-shaped. Terrified, they screamed and ran back toward the hogan. Something immediately chased after them, gaining on them with every step. They burst inside and slammed the door behind them, breathlessly telling their other sisters what had happened. All 5 of them sat in silence, waiting for whatever came next. The door of the hogan wasn't secure. It was just an old, worn door with a rickety latch nailed inside. The smoke hole in the roof was open to the sky. Then they heard something begin banging on the walls, hard enough to shake the entire structure. Heavy objects were tossed around outside, creating a chaotic, terrifying sound. Soon they heard the figure climb up onto the roof, pacing back and forth and occasionally peering down through the smoke hole, its face hidden in the darkness. There were adults nearby, a rude foster family living in another hogan, but when the girls cried out for help, they angrily ignored them. In desperation, my mom's 3 older sisters, who had been raised Catholic in boarding school, told her and the youngest to get on their knees, and they began praying to God for protection. One of the older girls had brought holy water from the church, and she sprinkled it near the door. Well, all night long, the Skinwalker circled the hogan, pounding on the door, and continued that eerie whistling. Despite how easy it would have been to break in, it never managed to harm them. Now to this day, my mom never learned what exactly it was that tried to frighten or hurt them that night. Medicine men can perform chants to reveal the identity of someone wishing harm, but that was never done. Looking back, my mom believes that the only reason they survived was the Heavenly Father watching over them. The Skinwalker continued to bother them occasionally afterwards, but they were never harmed. Thanks for letting me share. Signed, Derek. Dear Biker, I've held off making an official report because this happened so long ago, and I've always brushed the incident off. At the time, I was only about 8 to 11 years old, and I can't recall the exact year. It was sometime between 1960 and 1963. No one believed me back then because, well, I was just a kid. You see, every summer I stayed at my grandmother's house on Shank Road in Middletown, Maryland, in Frederick County. I always looked forward to being there, except for the outhouse. If I ever needed to use it at night, it meant waking Grandma to go with me, and neither of us enjoyed that. Well, one night I had to use the outhouse, and it was pitch black outside. There were no lampposts, no outdoor lighting along the lane. Grandma had electricity, but only for the house appliances and the oven. She even had an old floor model TV, but no one watched it. And there really wasn't much on Maryland airwaves in the early 60s anyway. Now, it must have been around 3 a.m. when I stepped outside. I didn't take a flashlight, and I didn't want to wake Grandma to find one or have her escort me. The outhouse, it sat well away from the rest of the buildings for obvious reasons. Even though it wasn't a full moon, just a half moon, there was enough light for my eyes to adjust. I followed the long, narrow flower garden as a guide. At the time, my biggest fear was stepping on a black snake or a copperhead, because I'd been warned constantly about them. Well, I made it to the outhouse, but I don't remember hearing any of the usual night sounds. No crickets or owls. It was almost too quiet. I was sharp and an imaginative kid, but what happened next wasn't something I could have dreamed up. I felt this uncanny sensation of being watched, and the longer I stayed out there, the more scared I became. After leaving the outhouse, I peeked outside, and something inside said, "Run." I just wanted to get back to the house as fast as possible. The run was rough and long, and I wore myself out quickly. So I ended up walking the last few hundred feet to the porch. And that's when something made me turn around and look back. And to this day, I still wish I hadn't. What I saw was unbelievable. This creature stepped through the backyard, just beyond the garden and about 10 feet from the outhouse. It was an upright, furry creature with a dog, wolf-like head. I'd owned German Shepherds since I was 7, and the shape of the ears and snout were almost the same. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It just didn't seem possible. Its arms hung forward, ending in large, claw-like hands. As it turned its head towards me, its eyes flashed yellow, and a chill shot straight up my spine. It moved quickly, walking on 2 legs. Legs that bent backwards like a real dog leg. Crossing from left to right past the garden, across the gravel lane, and into the thicket of woods until it disappeared. I could actually hear the weeds rustling as it moved away. It might have come from the pasture behind Grandma's house. That pasture was usually full, and it sat up an incline past the spring. But the thought that this thing could have been hiding behind the outhouse I was just in is a very real possibility, too. Well, after that night, I got teased for seeing the big bad wolf at Grandma's house, and nobody believed me. They thought that I'd made it up for attention, like an imaginary friend. So I buried the story and never told another soul until now. I just turned 62 this year, and even though it's far too late to make any official report, especially since I don't remember the exact year, but I'll never forget that creature for as long as I live. Signed, Mike. Hey TB, back in June of 1995, I was living on a large property near Spokane, Washington. One afternoon, I was mowing our big front lawn, which was dotted with old apple trees. As I passed one of the trees, I suddenly felt a strange presence nearby. On my second pass around that same corner, I sensed it again. I looked around but didn't see anything. On my third approach, I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, but that feeling returned just as strong. When I moved under the tree, I still couldn't spot anything there. Well, at this point, I was disturbed, confused, and honestly a bit frustrated. I know, without a doubt, that something was watching me, but there was no visible source. Now I was determined to figure out what was watching me. I made a fourth pass. As I neared the corner and felt that same feeling, I glanced back, and that's when I saw it. Perched about 8 feet up in the apple tree was a small being with dark, almond-shaped eyes. It was thin and almost translucent, with an opaque and wavering outline. I could see through parts of its body as though it was phasing in and out. It had slender limbs and was just sitting there, completely still, watching me. The sight nearly made me trip over the mower. And the longer I looked, the stranger it became. Its form seemed to fill in and then fade out, its edges rippling like heat waves. I was so stunned and unsettled that fear finally took hold. I abandoned the yard work and didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. I didn't want people to think I'd lost my mind. 3 days later, around 12:30 a.m., I was in bed reading while my girlfriend slept beside me. And suddenly, an intense tingling spread through my entire body. Not wanting to wake her, I got out of bed and walked to the large window overlooking the field next to our property. About 200 yards away, I saw a dimly lit, oval-shaped craft hovering just a few feet above the ground. Even from that distance, I could tell it was big enough that our neighbors should have been able to see it too. Through the long side windows, I could make out movement inside. A few white lights began blinking beneath the craft. I tried to wake my girlfriend, but she wouldn't stir. And then I felt a sudden pressure in my ears, and in an instant, the craft vanished. I believe that the being in the tree was either stranded or waiting to be picked up. I've always believed that we aren't alone in the universe, but that experience is what locked the idea in for sure. In 2009, I bought a farm in southeast Washington and moved there shortly after. Within the first week, I began noticing a lot of UFO activity, all of it seeming to originate from the mountains to the east. A young woman who lived nearby claimed that she had been abducted and taken to an underground base inside one of those mountains. One evening, she and her mother came over for dinner, and she reluctantly shared her story. It was the most frightening thing I've ever heard, and we felt awful for her. Maybe someday she'll be willing to come forward. I've given her your contact information. I hope you don't mind. Please let me know if she ever reaches out. Her experience is incredible. Signed, Gary. Dear Tattooed Biker, I came across your channel while searching for answers about something my daughter and I witnessed. And I found stories that sounded similar to ours. I'm from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and about 2 years ago, my daughter and I were out riding our bikes. It was a bright night because of the full moon, with only a few clouds drifting through and occasionally dimming the light. We stopped by a friend's house, and she and her 2 daughters came outside to talk with us. While we were chatting, I just happened to glance up, and that's when I saw it. A long, human-shaped figure with a wingspan of what looked like about 10 to 12 feet. It looked like something straight out of Jeepers Creepers. I was so stunned I couldn't even speak at first. I just pointed upward, as it slipped behind a cloud near the moon. Everyone laughed when I told them what I'd seen, but I insisted they keep looking. And then it appeared again. My daughter stood there staring, asking, "Mom, what is that?" over and over. I could tell that she felt the same unsettling dread that I did. My friends' daughters ran inside, screaming, but we kept watching as this creature flapped its wings and glided near the moon. After a few moments, it vanished into the clouds again and never reappeared. I know exactly what I saw that night, though I don't know how to describe it beyond a flying, human-like figure. It was an experience I wouldn't trade. Strange, frightening, and unforgettable. When I hear others share similar encounters, I genuinely want to believe that they witnessed the same thing. My daughter, who's 14 now, says there's so much out there we don't understand. What's myth and what's real? She's become fascinated with legends like the Jersey Devil, the Mothman, and even Slender Man. That night changed both of us, and we've never forgotten it. Signed, Sandra. Dear Sir, I used to live about an hour outside of Cherry Hill, New Jersey back in 2023, and one evening around sunset, my best friend and I were driving to my now wife's home. He was behind the wheel, and we were just heading out to hang out for a while. I was listening to music and watching the scenery go by out the window. As we approached a clearing where the power line towers ran through, I saw something rise into the open sky. It was a lanky, human-looking creature, but it had enormous black wings. It flew upward into the clearing in a way that froze both of us in shock. We were so stunned that we turned the car around to try and get another look, but by the time we made it back, whatever it was, it had disappeared. Now, we never talked about it with anyone. We were too afraid of being laughed at, but when I saw similar stories on your channel, I felt compelled to reach out. Mostly to assure people that have seen unexplainable things that they aren't crazy. I've lived in the woods of New Jersey my whole life, and I've encountered nearly every animal out there. This was absolutely not one of them. It was something entirely different, something deeply bizarre. Signed, Garrett. Dear Biker, I grew up near Nabria, Nebraska, not far from the river. My brother and I spent most of our childhood outdoors. We were out there year-round. One of our favorite things to do was fish the river for catfish. This was back in the 1950s, and things were different back then. Nobody cared much what you did as long as you weren't causing trouble. We usually fished in the mornings and the evenings during the summer. And in June of 1959, we planned to hike out to an area on Medicine Creek and spend a few nights there. It was about 5 miles from our home. On the second night there, we heard strange screaming sounds coming from one of the bluffs just west of us. It wasn't like anything we'd ever heard before. We also heard something heavy moving through the brush. I'll admit that we were scared, but eventually things quieted down as the night went on. The next morning, I walked out toward the bluff while gathering firewood. As I approached a rocky pass, I caught a glimpse of something big and hairy running away from me. It wasn't a bear. It was on 2 legs and it stood at least 7 feet tall. Its back was broad and massive. That was enough for me. I was ready to move camp somewhere else. My brother and I packed up and headed back toward the old trail. We had walked about a mile when we stopped to fish at a good spot we knew. We spent much of the day there, and by late afternoon we decided to hike back home. I wasn't feeling all that well anyway. The area looks a lot different today. It's part of a state park now, with roads and camp areas everywhere. But back then it was much more rugged. Around 6 p.m., near the footbridge over the river, my brother suddenly stopped and pointed toward a clearing on the riverbank. He said that someone was over there. We stood still for a moment and then watched as this giant, hairy creature stood straight up and looked right at us. It let out a loud grunt and swung its arm up over its head. We ran, and I don't think we stopped until we reached the roadway at the end of the trail. Now, over the years, we've talked about that encounter many times, and we're both certain it was a Bigfoot. I only told a friend about it years later, but he thought I was lying. We've gone back to that area many times and never noticed anything else. I contacted the BFRO back in the 90s, but they never came out or took a statement. Well, that's my story. Thanks. Signed, Gary T. Hi, Biker. I currently live in southern Illinois with my husband. But I grew up in rural Lyon County, Kentucky, where I spent much of my childhood in the woods and around the water. My dad and I spent most weekends fishing together. One early morning in April of 2001, when I was 14, we pulled the boat out of the slip and we headed south into the Lake Barkley. It was incredibly overcast with a heavy fog, and we almost decided to cancel the trip, but about an hour after we got onto the river, the sun began to break through, and that's when the fog started to lift. My dad suggested that we try a few brush piles in one of the shallow bays in the land between the lakes. He anchored the boat in one of the bays, and we began fishing in the brush piles. We were having a great morning, landing many crappie. After about an hour, the bite slowed down, so we decided to pause for lunch, and we sat in the boat about 100 feet from shore. I think it was close to noon, though I can't say for sure. When we had finished eating, Dad started pulling up the anchor, and that's when we heard a loud splash. We looked toward the brush pile, and we heard another. Dad thought that someone must have been throwing rocks, so he suggested that we move to another spot. As we began pulling away to the main lake, I noticed something moving along the shoreline. At first, I thought it was a man walking, but then realized it wasn't. This thing was massive and had hair all over its body. It was a Bigfoot. I yelled at Dad, and he looked where I pointed. He cut the motor, and we just sat there, watching this Bigfoot as it hurled rocks into the water like it was trying to hit something. We actually watched it for several minutes as it moved in and out of the brush. Now, Dad wanted to move in closer and try to take a picture with his phone, but I begged him not to. The water was shallow, and I was afraid that it might get angry and come after us. He tried to take a photo anyway, but for whatever reason, his phone wouldn't work properly. And then we noticed a smaller boat heading in our direction. The man aboard cut his motor and looked toward the Bigfoot as well. He absolutely saw it. His expression made it clear. Dad recognized him, and that made him even more upset. Since my dad was well known in the area, he worried about what would happen if people connected his name to a Bigfoot sighting. When we got home that evening, we told my mom what had happened, and she was upset too. After that, the story just kind of stops. I was told to never mention it again because of the trouble it might cause. I eventually told my husband not long after we were married. He had a positive reaction and has shown a lot of interest in what we encountered. I guess you could call us Bigfoot enthusiasts now. That's why we listen to you and Sean. We know that you take the unknown seriously, and we enjoy your podcasts. I want to remain anonymous because of my parents' concerns about what people might think. Signed, Anonymous.
He's got scars on his arms, flames on his chest, rides a steel horse, won't ever rest. Chasing whispers through the foggy pines, searching for truth that slipped through time. Moonlight bends where he rolls, the shadows speak. They've got souls, inking shadows, leather and lore. He's knocking on the other world's door. Bigfoot's howl, dog man's glare, men in black just vanishing there. Inking shadows, truth to find, paranormal trails in his mind.